Hey, so today I kind of wanted to talk about me and myself and I. I wanted to talk about, middle school more specifically. When I was at that age, I've been really rediscovering, maybe not rediscovering, I've been kind of like coming to accept more things from like at that point in time. And it is really interesting because the themes are pretty much the same of like what I want to do and what I can't do, and like the things that work out and things that don't work out, like they all have to do with the same insecurities, the same shortcomings that I had, the same image that I wanted to project. And although I will say that when I was in high school, this there was more definition to like this person I wanted to be, but like as I got older, I've kind of come to realize that it is pretty much the same version of myself that later on I would become, but at a time, because it's all very much informed by my experiences. So when I was 13, I had a different vision of myself and who I wanted to be compared to when I was 15 or 17. So when I thinking when I see, and also there was the very traumatic event that happened to me when I was 13. So there's that, and after that, like things changed for me. But even before that, there was like a lot of like moving pieces in my life, and that had to do with me me projecting a certain image of myself. And what I'm trying to say here is that basically thinking about elementary school to like the beginning of middle school, the insecurities I had, the person who I wanted to be, what ended up happening later was still very much a version of that, but like more insecurities ended up being added to the mix. But it had a lot to do with rejection, basically, is what I'm trying to get. The same thing that I am right now, being subjected to, basically, when I think about like those days, and how sensitive I was in some areas, and how much I struggled, you could say. I don't know. I feel like sometimes like you start comparing yourself with other people, and I feel like there's some people who struggle like much more to fit in than me. But at the same time, like I wasn't really, things were not really happening the way I wanted them to, at that point in time. So I was still, I don't know, I felt inadequate. But it was kind of like middle. It was there was some middle ground back there, in which like I wasn't the most popular, but I also wasn't the least popular. I wasn't the coolest, but I also wasn't the least cool. I wasn't. I didn't. I don't know. Don't you think about there are other traits for sure, and I do think that one that did stand out for me, one trait was the thing of being smart. Because when I was in elementary, middle school, like I was kind of like at the top of my class. Even in high school, I was also top of my class. It was only when I graduated and that like I started, because I think a good example way to put it is that like for you to get to like a good college, like you probably were at the top of your school, whatever you were. But when you get to that point, like everybody was at the top. So like you're no longer the top dog. You are kind of just one of many, and it doesn't help like if you start struggling with things, because those struggles, they'll kind of like make you question your identity. Because the thing for me is that I think because I was kind of like seen as the smart kid when I was at that age, I kind of like tied that to my personality. So like my identity was very much tied with me being smart, which meant that like every time I did something that was not smart, like there was this weight just dragging me down and just preventing me from actually living like a healthy life, honestly. Because I think that led to this very intense fear I have of failure, failing, myself, and also my objectives. Because I know it's technically the same, but in my head there are some distinctions. Because for example, like I have my goals, so I can kind of like betray my goals without betraying myself. I can do something that is good for me as a person, but isn't good for like whatever goals that I had. Although to be fair, you could argue that maybe my goal should always have my well-being in mind, and right now I think that is the case. But when I was younger, I was very much ready and willing to just go do whatever it took, and that involved like sacrificing myself, and not sacrificing myself for other people, but like for that future, and doing things that were not really good for my health. So I was really at that point. Like right now, that's no longer the case. I have like balance, in terms like that. But you can betray yourself, and you can also like do something that like it is not that's betraying yourself, but it helps you with your objectives, with your goals in life. And I find that like right now, when I look back, the best past decade is kind of like a mix of both, because it feels like I am going back and forth in some ways. Not necessarily, not because I'm changing my mind necessarily. It's just that I think there was some adjustments into like what I wanted to do, who I wanted to be, and all of that. And it's only, like much later that I can look back and be like, yeah, so like I was doing this at this point. I was out here doing things that were bad for me, but that did help me get there. And other times I was doing things that were getting in the way, because a lot of times like caring about yourself, and your well-being involves like you involves actions, things that you do to improve your condition. Sometimes if your goal is to achieve a certain thing at any cost, like it means that like by having a moment of self-care, like you're wasting the time that you should be doing something else. You should be kind of like focusing on progressing your career or whatever. So it wasn't so much like a back and forth. It was more like the first half of a decade I was a certain way, and then the second half I changed for the better. At least that's pretty much what I'm saying right now. And I mean, I know I'm right, because as I mentioned, like right now I care about my well-being. I don't want to do things that compromise. And of course, like life is hard, so like you can always avoid those moments, but I don't want to create more moments than necessary. So if there already going to be things that they're going to challenge my commitment to my well-being, I don't have to create more situations like that. I can just kind of like live and let myself live, because I feel like there was this controlling element of like me with myself. Like I was really, and I mean, of course, like self-control is a thing, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about me kind of like micromanaging like every little thing in a way that is not good for me. But yeah, so basically what I'm trying to say is that like when I was in middle school, I never really been fully happy with like who I was. Like I wouldn't acknowledge it to like this feeling for the longest time, but it is undeniable that there's been a certain discontentment that I have with myself, and my coping mechanism sometimes it was pretty much just like me bearing down the thing that I was supposed to insecure about, to suppress that, so that I could have this notion that I was that person, even though I was not. And it kind of like it continued. It started before the trauma and it continued afterwards. And it's interesting because as I said, like I think that like when I look back, I feel like I was very much the middle of the road in like every regard, except for like a couple of things that I think I was sending out. As I said before, academically, I had performance, but even then, like it was always that feeling of like I could have done better. Right now I understand that it's because of my ADHD, and that if I had been like medicated when I was a teenager, things would have been better for me. But like I'm not dwell in the past, particularly when it comes to things like this, that it took me so long for me to accept myself as I was and all that. So they happen, whatever. Also because it doesn't mean so much to me anymore. Like I'm not attached, because it's interesting, because when I was in high school, I was trying to kind of like start fresh, but at the same time, I wanted, to distance myself from like the person who I was before. But the principles, the values that I had, they were still the same. So I was trying to be different, while still holding the same interests, the same desires, and also like interesting, because I think the same thing happened. I think that from like elementary school to middle school, it was a little bit more of a seamless, continuation of things. But I will say that like I did have a few situations that they're kind. I don't want to say them because they're kind of like this nothing burgers, but at a time like they really impacted myself. They really changed the way I perceived the world, which makes sense, because when you're a kid, like things affect you more. Also because like you don't have as much experience, so like things, they can seem to be fresh. But basically what I'm trying to say is that I kind of like maintained the same kind of like goals for me, to be not goals in terms of like the future, where I wanted to get, but in terms of like who I was and how I was perceived in the present, by my peers. And I mentioned this before, for so long I was very much anti this whole notion of me accepting that I cared. I really wanted to not care about what people had to say. But I'm kind of like done with the pretense. Like I used to care, and I used to care before that, and I still kind of like do. Although I would say that like right now is the healthiest I've ever been. So like I don't care so much anymore. But like it took me many years for me to get to this point. Although I would like to pretend that I've been like this since forever. But yeah. So what ended up happening, is that these kind of like wounds, they kind of festered, because as I said, like I was insecure about some of these things, but I wasn't really doing anything in terms of fixing it. At least I was trying, but very ineffectively, basically. And although I will say that things like me, when I look back, I feel like that is not going to lead to the results that you want. But at the time, like I think that it was okay for me to think that way, because I didn't know better. I was a kid and I was behaving like a kid, which I think is something that is also like worth considering for me, because on one hand, something that has happened in the past, particularly, I don't care so much about it anymore, but when I was a kid, I really enjoyed the fact that people said that was mature for my age. And I'm not talking about creeps, like there were those two, but like I'm talking about my my teachers, my coordinators, my family, people, just anyone who had contact, adults who had contact with me, and they always had that thing of like, no, you're so mature for your age, and I love that. That really did something for me. It made me feel good about myself, and it's interesting because like right now, I don't really care. Particularly, I mean, I still have issues with like my age. I mean, every year it's the same thing. I'm getting older. What am I doing with my life? How, like, what am I going to do with my life? I keep on living. Those are not the questions I have answers for today, so I don't want to, even engage with them. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that, oh God, I lost my train of thought. Fuck. Okay, let me continue from where I was before. But yeah, so this thing about me being much of my age, like that is something that made me feel like very grown up, which is interesting because I think it's a very common thing that when you're a kid you want to grow up, but when you're grown up you just wish you can go back to being a kid. I will say that like I feelings like that, it was kind of like a mixed bag for me, because on one hand I tried to enjoy like the time that I was living, but I couldn't wait for the future where I'll be able to achieve my goals, my objectives, and I would be able to make a name for myself, and become known, and all those things that you think of when you are a teenager. And that's not how things ended up happening. That they didn't work out that way. And I'm not here to make an assessment about whether like that is a good or a bad thing, because I want to be more neutral, because you might think that because sometimes feeling positively about things in your life, like it can be good, particularly if you have like history of like that being something that is like demonized, or made you feel bad. Yeah, like things that you're made to feel bad because of who you are. And I'm talking about like demographical things, but also personality traits, just very pointless things that they're not really good or bad. And yeah, and that's kind of like, so in this particular case, I think sometimes it's important for you to just be positive with yourself, just affirming that you're good and things are good. But I feel like there are some times where it doesn't work that way. I don't want to have positive or negative feelings about something. I just want to be neutral about them. And I think that maybe it might be a phase I'm going through it, because as I said before, there are some of these areas that I was very much like I'm trying to make myself think positively about. But I think a good example, like that, something that started making me think about this a few years ago was like the way you look at your body, because there's body positivity, and I think that's important. You should feel like be at ease with yourself, regardless of whether you're going to stay the same or